The stallion was a monument to fury, a creature of midnight silk and honed muscle forged in the crucible of war. For 3 years, since the Duke of Blackwood had brought him back from the continent, Erebus had thrown every rider. Grooms scattered like dry leaves when he pinned his ears, his hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones of the training yard. He was magnificent, broken, and utterly untouchable. Today, Lord Alistair Blackwood, the Duke himself, stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of granite, as another would-be horseman limped away, cursing. The Duke's stillness was more menacing than any shout. It was a cold, contained pressure that made the air thin around him. His dark coat was cut with military precision, his jaw was tight, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed nothing. He had a reputation as severe and unyielding as the stone of his ancestral home. A man who had bent armies to his will, but could not master a single beast. A murmur went through the assembled staff and tenants. The Duke's temper was a thing of legend, and its eruption seemed imminent. But then a figure detached itself from the shadows of the stable block. It was a girl, a scullery maid by the plainness of her grey dress, her hair pinned in a simple, severe knot. Alara. She moved not with bravado, but with a quiet, deliberate grace, her eyes fixed on the horse. A groom tried to grab her arm. "Miss, don't! He'll kill you." She paid him no mind, her focus absolute. The Duke's gaze snapped to her, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. He did not suffer fools, and this was the height of folly. He opened his mouth to deliver a sharp, cutting order for her removal, but the words died on his lips. Alara did not approach the stallion head-on. She circled, her steps soft on the dusty ground, never breaking her gaze from his. She wasn't looking at him as a challenge, or as a problem to be solved, but as a creature in pain. She murmured to him, her voice too low for anyone else to hear, a soft, crooning sound that was swallowed by the tense silence of the yard. Erebus, who had been snorting and stamping, tossing his great head, suddenly went still. His ears, which had been flat against his skull, twitched forward. He watched her, his large, dark eye liquid and intelligent. She stopped a few feet from him, holding out a hand, palm down, and waited. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. The Duke had not moved a muscle, his expression unreadable. Minutes passed. Then, with a great, shuddering sigh that seemed to drain the fury from his body, the Warhorse took a step forward. He lowered his massive head and touched his nose to her offered hand. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Alara's fingers stroked the velvet of his muzzle, then moved to the bridle. And then, the impossible happened. The great Warhorse, the killer, the untamable beast, bent his forelegs and sank to his knees on the cobblestones before the Maid. He knelt. The yard was utterly silent, save for the whisper of the wind. The Duke finally moved, his boots crunching on the gravel as he strode toward her. He stopped before her, a towering, formidable figure, and looked from the kneeling horse to the girl whose hand rested on its bridle. His voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a low, resonant command that cut through the silence and sealed her fate. You will come with me. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you enjoy tales of quiet strength and unexpected connection, be sure to subscribe for more. We'd love to know where you're watching from today. Alara's life before that moment had been a study in being overlooked. She was the daughter of a country veterinarian, a man with a gentle heart and hands that could soothe any beast, but with a mind for figures that was as porous as a sieve. After her mother's death, her father had married Lady Anya, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. With Anya came 2 daughters who treated Alara like a ghost in her own home. Her skills, inherited from her father, were not celebrated but exploited. It was Alara who knew which mare was about to foal, which poultice would draw a fever, which tone of voice would calm a panicked hunter. It was Alara who secretly managed the dwindling household accounts, stretching shillings into pounds through shrewd negotiation with suppliers, a talent for which her stepmother took full credit. She was the silent, unacknowledged engine that kept the crumbling estate running. Her reward was contempt. Meals were often a trial of subtle cruelties. "Ilara, dear," Lady Anya would say, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she placed a meagre portion of gristly meat on Alara's plate. "You work so hard with those filthy animals, you mustn't trouble yourself with rich food." Her stepsisters would titter behind their hands. The final betrayal came dressed as salvation. A neighbouring lord, a man twice her father's age with a wet mouth and grasping hands, had offered to forgive her father's mounting debts in exchange for Ilara's hand in marriage. Her father, his face pale and strained, had refused to meet her eyes as he signed the papers. Lady Anya had smiled. "You see," she'd told Ilara, her eyes glittering, "your affinity for beasts has finally paid off. You have purchased our security." The night before the wedding, Ilara packed a small canvas bag with a change of clothes, the locket containing her mother's portrait, and the last few coins she had managed to hide. Her one ally, a young stable hand named Thomas, who had always treated her with a quiet respect, left a loaf of bread and a flask of water for her by the stable gate. She didn't know where she was going, only that she could not stay. She walked for 2 days, sleeping in barns and surviving on the kindness of strangers, until she arrived, desperate and exhausted, at the gates of the Blackwood estate, begging for any work, no matter how lowly. They had given her a place in the scullery, where she had remained, invisible, until the day the Duke's Warhorse knelt at her feet. The Duke's home was not a house, it was a fortress. Blackwood Manor rose from the moorland like a jagged outcrop of granite, its lines severe, its windows narrow and watchful. Inside, the great hall was a cavern of shadows and silence, the air cold and still. Dark, polished wood drank the light, and the few portraits that hung on the walls depicted ancestors with faces as stern and unforgiving as the Duke's own. The staff moved like ghosts, their footfalls muffled by thick runners, their voices kept to a respectful murmur. It was a place devoid of warmth, of life, of comfort. It was the architectural embodiment of its master. Ilara followed the Duke up a grand, sweeping staircase, her worn shoes silent on the cold marble. He did not look back. He led her to a heavy oak door and pushed it open, gesturing for her to enter his study. The room was lined from floor to ceiling with books, a rolling ladder leaning against one wall. A massive desk stood before a tall, arched window that looked out over the bleak beauty of the moors. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the room's chill. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to a leather chair. He remained standing, his back to the fire, his shadow looming large. He watched her for a long moment, his gaze intense, analytical. "You have a gift," he said, his voice flat. It was not a compliment, it was a statement of fact. "My horse, Erebus, has not allowed a soul to touch him in 3 years. He has crippled 2 of my best men. You calmed him with a word." Ilara said nothing, her hands folded in her lap. She met his gaze directly, her own expression calm. She had learned long ago that showing fear was an invitation for cruelty. "I do not care how you did it," he continued, his tone as crisp as a military order. "I care only that you can do it again. I am offering you a position. You will no longer work in the kitchens. You will have charge of my stables. You will answer to no one but me. You will be responsible for Erebus, and for every other animal on this estate. You will have a private room in the East Wing, a salary of £20 a year, and my protection." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "In return, you will ensure my horses are fit for service. My accounts are in order, and my warhorse is ready to ride when I command it. This is a transaction, Miss Vance, she supplied quietly. Miss Vance, do not mistake it for anything else. I do not require your friendship or your counsel. I require your competence. Do you understand the terms? It was the coldest, most impersonal offer she could imagine. He spoke of her gift as if it were a tool he was purchasing. And yet his indifference was a strange kind of relief. It was honest. There was no false sweetness, no hidden agenda, no pretense of affection that would later be used as a weapon. There was only the stark, clean line of a contract. Coldness was survivable. It was the pretense of warmth that had always burned her. I understand, Your Grace, she said, her voice steady. I accept. Her new life began not in the cold grandeur of the manor, but in the earthy, fragrant world of the stables. The space was well built, with solid oak stalls and high, vaulted ceilings, but a subtle air of neglect hung over it. The head groom, a burly man named Griggs, viewed her appointment with open hostility, his face a thundercloud of resentment that a slip of a girl, a former scullery maid, had been placed above him. The other stable hands followed his lead, offering sullen silence and grudging obedience. Alara did not challenge them directly. Instead, she worked. She rose before dawn, her first visit always to Erebus. The great stallion would nicker softly as she approached, dropping his head into her hands. She spoke to him in the same low murmur she had used in the yard, a touch gentle as she checked his legs and groomed his silken coat. She saw the old scars crisscrossing his flanks, the lingering tension in his powerful muscles, and understood that his fury was born of memory and pain. Then she turned her attention to the rest of the stable. She reviewed the feed orders, discovering they were paying for premium oats but receiving a cheaper, dust-filled mix. She changed the supplier. She reorganized the tack room, cleaning and oiling brittle leather. She spent hours simply observing, learning the rhythms of the animals and the men. She noticed a young mare with a persistent cough and diagnosed a lung ailment the farrier had missed, mixing a poultice of herbs that eased the filly's breathing within a day. Slowly, cautiously, the atmosphere began to shift. The younger stable hands, seeing the undeniable improvements in the horse's health and temperament, started coming to her with questions. Griggs's hostility remained, but it was now tinged with a grudging watchfulness. From the window of his study, the Duke observed it all. He saw her moving through the yard with quiet authority, her plain dress smudged with dust, her hands never still. He watched as she calmed a spooked carriage horse with a touch and a word. He saw the respect beginning to bloom on the faces of his men. He said nothing, his expression as remote as ever, but he did not miss a single detail. Their paths rarely crossed. Sometimes, late at night, unable to sleep, she would slip into the main house, making her way to the vast, silent library to consult a veterinary text or review the estate ledgers he had, without comment, given her access to. On more than one occasion she found him there, seated in a high-backed chair by the fire, a book open in his lap, his gaze distant. They would incline their heads in a silent acknowledgement of the other's presence. No words were exchanged, but a strange sort of companionship grew in the shared silence, in the quiet turning of pages under the soft glow of a single lamp. It was an intimacy of proximity, a coexistence that asked for nothing and yet, slowly, began to feel like something. The Duke's trust in her competence grew in quiet, incremental steps. After she had exposed the fraudulent feed supplier, he had summoned her to the study and, without preamble, pushed a stack of heavy, leather-bound ledgers across the desk. "The household accounts," he had stated. "Find the discrepancies." It was not a request. For weeks, Alara spent her evenings in the library, the scent of old paper and leather filling her senses, as she traced lines of ink with her finger. The numbers told a story of quiet, persistent theft. Overpriced goods, ghost employees on the payroll, repairs billed for but never completed. The architect of the scheme, she soon realized, was Mr. Finch, the steward, a man who had served the Duke's father and whose loyalty had been considered absolute. The evidence was damning, woven through years of falsified records. One night, while searching for older ledgers to cross-reference a date, she climbed the rolling ladder to the highest shelf. Her fingers brushed against a volume that was out of place, a slim book of poetry wedged behind a row of thick agricultural treatises. Curious, she pulled it out. Tucked inside was not a poem, but a sheaf of folded legal documents, brittle with age. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the first page. It was a deed of sale for her father's modest estate, listing all his assets, his debts, and the final purchase price. The name of the buyer, signed in a bold black script at the bottom, was Alistair Blackwood. A cold dread washed over her, so profound it made her dizzy. She gripped the ladder, the papers trembling in her hand. He hadn't just bought the debt. He had bought everything, her home, her past. He had owned her long before she ever set foot on his land. The library, which had begun to feel like a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. The trust she had cautiously begun to build crumbled into dust. Was her entire life a calculated acquisition? Was she just another asset, secured for her unique skill like a prize mare? The questions churned within her, a nauseating mix of betrayal and fear. She descended the ladder, her legs unsteady. Clutching the papers, she walked out of the library and down the silent corridor to his study. The door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hall. She did not knock. She pushed the door open and found him standing by the window, staring out at the moonlit moors. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. She walked to the desk and laid the documents on the polished wood. "I believe," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "You owe me an explanation, Your Grace." Alistair looked from the papers on his desk to her face, his expression hardening into something impenetrable. He did not seem surprised, merely resigned. He walked over, picked up the deed, and glanced at it as if it were a common household bill. "So you have found it," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I wondered if you would." The casual admission was like a slap. "You wondered?" Alara's voice was tight with disbelief and a fury she hadn't felt in years. "You purchased my home. You orchestrated the ruin of my family. Was my arrival here a coincidence, or was I merely the final piece of the acquisition?" He met her gaze, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something behind the glacial calm, a weariness, deep and profound. "It was not about you, Miss Vance, or your father," he said, his tone still maddeningly level. "It was about Lord Ashworth." Alara frowned. "What does Lord Ashworth have to do with this?" "Your stepmother's brother," he supplied, "and my most dedicated rival. For years, he and I have been engaged in a quiet war, fought not on battlefields, but in boardrooms and banks. He sought to undermine my shipping interests. I sought to acquire the debts of his associates to gain leverage. Your father was one of many. His finances were already precarious. Ashworth encouraged his foolish investments, knowing he would fail. I merely bought the debt before he could. It was business. I did not know of your existence until the day you walked into my stable yard." His explanation was cold, logical, and utterly ruthless. He spoke of lives and fortunes as if they were pieces on a chessboard. And yet, beneath the chilling pragmatism, she sensed a sliver of truth. He was not apologizing, but he was being honest. "So I was collateral damage," she stated, the words tasting like ash. "Yes," he said without hesitation, "you were." The stark honesty of the admission disarmed her. He could have lied, could have crafted a more palatable story, but he did not. He offered her the unvarnished, ugly truth, a gesture that was, in its own way, a profound form of respect. Before she could process this, the butler appeared at the door, his face pale. "Your Grace, a visitor. Lord Ashworth. He is demanding to see Miss Vance." A cold snake of dread coiled in Alara's stomach. Alistair's eyes narrowed. "Show him into the drawing-room." He looked at Alara. "He cannot force you to do anything. You are under my protection." Lord Ashworth was as polished and predatory as Alara remembered, his smile a thin, bloodless line. He rose as they entered, his eyes dismissing the Duke and fixing on her with a look of feigned concern. "Alara, my dear girl, I have been worried to death. When I heard you had taken a position here, I came at once to rescue you." "I do not require rescuing, my lord," Alara said, her voice clear and steady. Ashworth's smile tightened. "Nonsense. This is no place for a gently bred young woman. You will come home. Your place is with your family." "The family that sold me?" Alara countered, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. The Duke stood silently by the fireplace, a watchful sentinel. "A misunderstanding." Ashworth waved a dismissive hand. "You belong to us, and I have come to collect what is mine. Miss Vance," the Duke's voice cut in, cold as steel, "is the master of my estates. She is not a piece of property to be collected. She is here by her own choice, and she will remain, unless she chooses otherwise." Ashworth's face flushed with anger. He took a step toward Alara, his mask of civility slipping. "You will regret this defiance." "No," Alara said, stepping forward, no longer hiding behind the Duke's protection. "It is you who will regret this intrusion. This is my home now. You are not welcome here. Leave." For a moment, the two men locked gazes over her head, a silent battle of wills. Then, with a sneer, Ashworth turned on his heel and strode from the room. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The aftermath of the confrontation left the air in the manor thick with unspoken tension. Dinner was a silent affair, the clink of silver against porcelain unnaturally loud in the vast dining room. Alara found she could not eat. The ugly truth of her past and the sudden menacing reappearance of Lord Ashworth had left her shaken. Later that evening, drawn by an instinct she didn't fully understand, she made her way to the library. She needed the quiet solidity of the books, the familiar scent of paper and leather to steady her nerves. She found the Duke there, as she had suspected she might. He wasn't reading. He was standing before the fire, one hand braced against the marble mantelpiece, staring into the flames. He looked weary. The iron control he usually maintained seemed to have settled deeper, becoming less a shield and more a burden. He glanced up as she entered, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "He will not trouble you again tonight," he said, his voice low. "I have had men posted at the gates." "Thank you," she whispered, moving to stand near the opposite side of the hearth. For a long time they stood in silence, the only sound the crackle and hiss of the fire. The space between them was charged, a field of unresolved emotions. It was Alara who finally broke the silence. "I am not accustomed to being defended," she said, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. It was a simple statement of fact, but it held the weight of her entire life. He turned his head to look at her, truly look at her, his eyes tracing the lines of her face in the warm light. "And I," he responded, his voice rough with an unfamiliar emotion, "I'm not accustomed to having anyone worth defending." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unexpected. It cracked the granite facade of his composure, revealing the man beneath. He had been betrayed before, She could see it now in the guardedness of his posture, in the profound loneliness that clung to him like a shroud. This shared vulnerability, this quiet acknowledgement of past wounds, was more intimate than any touch. "What he said about you being collateral," he began, his voice strained. "It was the truth, but it is a truth that I find I no longer have any taste for. Your presence here, your work. You have brought order to the chaos of this place, to the chaos in me." He took a step away from the fireplace, closing the distance between them. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He did not touch her, but his proximity was overwhelming. "I did not bring you here for your own sake," he confessed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But I would keep you here for mine." He slowly raised a hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was tentative, almost reverent, the calloused skin of his fingertips a stark contrast to the softness of her skin. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound, aching tenderness. In that moment the contract between them dissolved, burned away by the heat of the fire and the weight of his admission. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart did not so much fall as simply cease to exist. He held her gaze, and in the depths of his winter-grey eyes, Elara saw not a duke, not a master, but a man choosing, finally, to be seen. The Duke was hosting the annual Autumn Hunt Ball, a grand affair that brought the county's aristocracy to Blackwood Manor. It was a political necessity, an event he endured rather than enjoyed. This year, however, was different. Rumours, venomous and swift, had been circulating for weeks, seeded by a vengeful Lord Ashworth. They painted Elara as a conniving opportunist, a low-born servant who had somehow bewitched the reclusive Duke. Tonight, society had come to stare, to whisper, and to judge. Elara stood at the top of the grand staircase, her heart pounding. The Duke had insisted she attend not as a member of his staff, but as his guest of honour. A seamstress had been summoned from London, and she now wore a gown of deep midnight blue silk that shimmered in the light of 1,000 candles. It felt like a costume, a beautiful lie. Then she saw him, waiting for her at the foot of the stairs. He was dressed in formal black, the severe lines of his coat emphasizing his height and the breadth of his shoulders. As their eyes met across the teeming ballroom, the crowd seemed to fade away. He offered her his arm, his hand warm and steady over hers. "They are watching," she murmured, her voice tight. "Let them," he replied, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. As they descended, a hush fell over the assembly. Every eye was upon them. Lord Ashworth, holding court near the orchestra, smirked, confident in his social sabotage. He chose his moment when the Duke was called away by a government minister. He approached Elara, his smile oozing condescension. "My dear Elara," he said, his voice loud enough for all those nearby to hear. "You clean up remarkably well. One would almost forget you spent your days mucking out stables." A ripple of cruel laughter went through the surrounding guests. Elara felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, the Duke was there. He had moved through the crowd with a silent, deadly grace. He did not address Ashworth. Instead, he turned to the assembled company, his voice clear and commanding, ringing through the suddenly silent ballroom. "Allow me to introduce you all properly," he began, his hand resting possessively on the small of Elara's back. "This is Miss Elara Vance, and while Lord Ashworth is correct that she has spent time in my stables, he has neglected to mention the results." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "Under her management, my breeding program, which had been failing for a decade, is now the most profitable in the North." My accounts, which were being systematically plundered, are now balanced. The yields from my tenants' farms have increased by 20%, thanks to the efficiencies she introduced. She is not a guest in my home. She is its master." He then turned his cool, assessing gaze directly on Ashworth. Indeed, Miss Vance's forensic accounting uncovered a great many things, including a series of fraudulent land deeds traced back to a syndicate run by a man who, it seems, has been financing his lavish lifestyle by bankrupting his own associates. Panic flared in Ashworth's eyes. The whispers in the crowd shifted from derision to speculation. The Duke had not merely defended her, he had armed her, validated her, and turned her supposed shame into a testament to her brilliance. He had shown them her true worth, not in terms of birth or beauty, but in competence and character. Ashworth, pale and sweating, tried to stammer a denial, but the tide of public opinion had already turned against him. He was no longer a charismatic lord, he was a common swindler, exposed. Humiliated, he turned and fled the ballroom. The Duke looked down at Alara, his expression softening. "Shall we dance?" he asked quietly. And as he led her on to the floor, the whispers that followed them were no longer of scandal, but of awe. A year had passed. Spring had come to Blackwood, not with a sudden burst, but with a slow, gentle unfurling. The formal gardens, which had been neglected for decades, were now a riot of colour and life. Paths once choked with weeds were now clear, lined with vibrant borders of lavender and delphinium. The old gnarled roses that had been left for dead had been carefully pruned and staked, and now they climbed the stone walls, their blossoms scenting the air. Alara had tended to the garden herself, working alongside the elderly groundskeeper, finding a quiet satisfaction in bringing beauty back to a forgotten space. It mirrored the work she had done on the house and on its master. She was standing on the central path, her hands resting on the warm stone of a sundial, when Alistair came to join her. He no longer wore the severe military-style coats of their first acquaintance. Today he was in his shirt sleeves, the fabric rolled up to his elbows, looking less like a duke and more like a country squire. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar comfort. For a long while, they simply stood together, listening to the drone of bees and the distant call of a cuckoo. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a shared space of peace. Erebus, the great warhorse, grazed contentedly in the nearby paddock, his coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. He was a different creature now, gentle and trusting, a living symbol of the transformation they had all undergone. "This place was a fortress when you came," Alistair said, his voice quiet. "A cold, well-defended prison of my own making. You have made it a home." Alara looked up at him, her heart full. "And you, my lord, what has it made you?" He turned to face her, taking her hands in his. His hands were large and warm, calloused from years of holding sword hilts and reins, but his touch was gentle. He looked down at their joined hands, then met her eyes. His own were clear, the colour of a summer sky now, not a winter one. "You have made me whole," he said. The words were spoken plainly, without artifice or flourish, in the same factual tone he might use to state the time or the weather, and because of that, they were the most profound declaration of love she could ever imagine. He lifted her left hand and slid a simple, elegant ring onto her fourth finger. It was a band of gold, set with a single, deep blue sapphire that matched the gown she had worn to the ball. "Alara Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "My partner, my master of estates, my heart, will you be my wife?" She didn't need to speak. The answer was in her smile, in the tears that welled in her eyes, in the way she leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, and together they stood in the heart of the garden they had brought back to life. Two solitary, damaged souls who had, against all odds, found their way home to each other. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. This story is a testament to the idea that love can grow in the most unexpected soil. We have to ask, would you have trusted a man who was instrumental in your family's ruin, even if he offered you safety? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Remember, the best alliances often begin as the most honest transactions.